Hey everyone, hopefully you can see us. If you don't mind, myself and Jack Linke, is that how we say your name?
That's correct. Yep.
Okay. Can you hear the two of us well? Do we have good audio? Jack, can you say something?
Testing, testing.
Okay. Can someone say if we have good audio? So hopefully, all right, I tell you what, I will check on YouTube myself
All right.
and just to make sure. Oh, so Vance, thank you,
All right.
Vance. Looks like we are good. Okay. Good, depending on where you are, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. My name is Daniel Roy Greenfeld. This is episode one of, hopefully, episode one of many episodes of Code, 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 where I'm going to be spending some time talking about tech with peers and colleagues. And Jack Linke has agreed to be our first first person up. And Jack, if I know we're gonna be talking about HTMX, but if you can give a quick, uh, I guess why don't we just jump right into your presentation? That might be the best way because I know your presentation covers who you are. Does that sound good?
Yeah, that sounds
Okay.
good.
All right.
All right. Well, I will. I'll go ahead and share my screen and get to it then.
Okay.
Jack link joined.
All right. And then
All right.
here we go.
And hopefully, can you see the welcome?
I can see the welcome. Let's see if our viewers can see the welcome. Okay, it looks like no one's complained thus far, so we're gonna go ahead and assume that people can see what we're doing.
Okay. So, as Danny said, my name is Jack Linke. Um, I've been developing with Django since about 2018, and sort of fell into it a little bit accidentally, but I've been having fun since then and learning a lot. I am a Python Software Foundation contributing member. Um, I contribute to a bunch of different open source projects and also do some leadership on some forums online. Uh, I'm the main developer for a Django-based commercial application that's used for helping irrigation and water utilities districts to manage their resources. And I've been part of the HTMX community since it really started, um, for the most part in 2020. It's a pretty new library, and I've been really fortunate to kind of get in from the start. So my presentation is called Server Side is Dead, Long Live Server Side plus HTMX. And we're going to kind of talk through some of the really cool things that you can do with HTMX to build a modern web application without needing a lot of the really complex JavaScript stuff that's out there. So a little background on my experience. I kind of started with programming initially when I was a lot younger, um, and when I first started working with the web, Web 2.0 was really a new thing. There was dynamic content. It was exciting that you had user generated stuff that was saved to a database and then displayed to the users. So it was, dynamic in that way that a page would load uh, information from the database. Instead of just being static HTML pages, which is what I started out with, in the late 90s. And then it became interactive and social. You had things like MySpace and whatnot, kind of at the beginning of the Web 2.0 era. And again, you had a web server and a database on the back end, and it was all serving HTML that was, pulled, some of that information pulled dynamically from the database. So what's the current state? Well, if you're using Django, you've got Django templates, but it's not super clear how you're supposed to provide, the interactivity that's expected in today's modern web apps. You could use vanilla JavaScript. jQuery was kind of required for a while there, and Django's getting away from that. There's single page applications where you have hopefully not just a single div with multiple more divs inside of it, but single page application. The idea is that um, things are happening without a bunch of page reloads. A lot of the modern web applications you'll find online are single page applications. And then you can use things like Vue or React or Angular directly, um, but it's really complicated. If you look at the different frameworks for web development over the past decade or so, and here's a diagram that shows some of that. There's just an incredible amount of choice. Most of these displayed in this diagram are front-end specific sorts of libraries. You will see there's some stuff like Django in there, but there's just so many different frameworks and tools for front end. It can be really challenging and a little scary to figure out. Well, how do I build something modern, something that is dynamic, um, and something that looks good when I have all of these different choices, and when the Django templates themselves are not really set up to be, um, to allow the same sort of dynamic uh, loading without page refreshes that some of these other tools provide. The front end development roadmap, and let me show you a little better view of that. So this is an image from a person online that put together a roadmap of 2021, what's kind of expected of a developer. Um, and you'll see when it comes to the top of this image is all front end stuff. So you've got JavaScript and then CSS stuff, and it just gets a little crazy, right? You've got React and Redux and all these different frameworks for building interactivity into your app. Um, and it just keeps going and going and going. So what do we do with all that? What do we really need all of that complexity? As I mentioned, there's not really a good standard Django approach for modern front end development. So what can we do? Well, one potential is to use HTMX instead of Vue or React or some of those heavier libraries. And one of the nice things is that image that I showed you earlier, that developer roadmap, about half of the stuff on that picture really goes away and is not really required if you use HTMX with Django. You can get rid of a whole bunch of those and still have a lot of flexibility and dynamism in your website. So HTMX is really intended to be an extension to HTML. It is, um, in the author's opinion, it's basically what HTML should have evolved to become, but instead we kind of got JavaScript, kind of took over that role. HTML never really evolved beyond the initial tags and functionality, so it's intended to augment that. HTMX is backend agnostic. You bring your own backend, so that means that really any web server um, backend tooling works with HTMX just fine. HTMX is focused. It does a few things really well. It's not designed to do things like there's some really cool libraries out there like data tables and mapping tools. And HTMX isn't designed to help you build a big component like that. It's really focused. And we'll talk about some of the things that it's focused on and it can do for you. And it allows you to access AJAX So AJAX is asynchronous communications to the back end, so you can do things like loading content without refreshing the entire page. It can do some CSS transitions, WebSockets and server sent events, so you can do some really cool asynchronous stuff, and it all directly from the HTML in your page. And it's a very small library. It's only about 11 kilobits, which is nice when you compare it to some of the big JavaScript frameworks out there that can be a huge amount more than that. So we'll talk about 4 different features or approaches to using HTMX. And these are just a few examples. There are a whole lot more, including on the HTMX website, which I'll mention to you later on. But these are 4 examples that I've found very useful, and hopefully, the So the first thing we'll look at is inbox functionality. So a lot of times, a lot of different apps will have an inbox of some sort, whether that's actual email or a notification system. You'll have some sort of thing where you have messages of some sort in a list, and you want to be able to mark them as read or archive them in some way. So in this example, we're doing exactly that. You've got messages coming in, and you'll see there's 2 messages in this picture here. The first one is already archived, and the second one is brand new. And you'll see a little button on the right in yellow that would allow you to archive it. And I'll show you a live demo of this in a few minutes. But just for frame of reference, this is what it looks like. So when we initially look at what's required, on the left side you'll see the Django view without HTMX. And on the right, you'll see how we would change that to use HTMX. And for each of these examples that I'm going to go through, I'll kind of show you the same order. We'll look at the view, the form if there's a form, and the HTML itself, and kind of get a side by side of the before and after for what it takes to change that into an HTMX view. And before I go any further, I should have mentioned here the thing that we want to achieve in this example is that when I click that archive button, it should archive the message without the page reloading. So in the view on the left, with this view, if I click that archive button, the entire page refreshes to show me that it's been archived. With the one on the right, just the content of the message itself will change, and the entire page won't have to reload. So this is a pretty basic view. You'll see we've got a template. We're looking to see if this is a post request, and if it is, then we are marking the message as read and returning the response. On the right side, the HTMX view, really the only significant change is that if it's a post request, then we are loading a different template. In this case, it's just what we're calling a fragment. And we'll look at the HTML for this in a little bit. And we add that, we add the message itself back into the context and then return it all. So the HTML for this functionality, again, this this is looking at the HTMX view or the HTMX HTML. So we have our form, and this is going to be exactly the same whether we're doing it with HTMX or not. And then on the bottom, you'll see the this is the totality, the whole message portion that's displayed in that list is a bunch of these divs repeated, one for each message. So the only significant difference you'll see if we're doing HTMX is this highlighted portion. So we've added an ID that lists, it's prefixed with whatever. Here I just put li list and then the message ID. And the reason that we have this is that we're going to, this kind of lets HTMX have a foothold on this div. So as we look down here, I'll explain this a little bit. We have these data-hx attributes here. And in reality, it could just be hx-post, hx-swap. But HTMX allows you to prepend this data portion onto these just so that your IDE doesn't complain. If you look at the actual documentation for HTMX, really the entirety of the attribute is just hx-post. All right, so what's going on in this HTML down here? We start off with hx-post, which just means everything in the form itself, we're going to post to this URL messaging inbox.htmx. And that's points to this same view that we were looking at earlier. So we're posting the content, of all of this to inbox.htmx. HX swap is telling this span tag, it's telling it to swap the outer HTML. HX target is saying that we're going to swap that outer HTML for the li list message ID, which again is the div that's encompassing this entire component or whatever you want to call it. We're going to include in the post request hx include the name item. So that's this hidden input I've got here with the message ID. And then this is just a submit button. So at the end of the day, just to recap all of that, for each one of these messages, and again, this div, let me go back a couple pages. That's this and this. It's just repeated for that list for each message. We're repeating this entire div. What's happening, just to recap, is when I click on the button, the span here, it's going to post the it's going to post to inbox HTML that view with the message ID, and then it's going to replace whatever we get back in this entire div. And if I go back one page to our view, what we're sending from the view, upon a post request, is this message fragment .htmx with the message after we've marked it red. So hopefully that's a little bit clear. The template fragment, that small fragment, this div here, is used for the initial display of each message, and it's used for the swapped content. And this is how we're doing that in the page. For each message, we're including that fragment. And then the swapped content replaces the original content. So let me show you a quick demo. So we've got our inbox, and I've got a bunch of different messages in here, and none of them have been read yet. So if I click on this archive button, you'll see the entire page refreshes in order for me to see that this message has been read. So that's the original functionality. And with the modifications that we made for the HTMX version, here's the same exact content using the same model on the back end. And now if I click archive, you'll see instantly it refreshes and I can see that that's been archived. And if I load this page again, you'll see that that change has actually been made in the back end. So when I click on one of these archive buttons, again, what's happening is when I click that, a post request is going to the inbox view. The message in the model instance, the message is getting marked as read, and then that view is returning this content, which is being replaced into the div. And you'll see right here, when I just click that, we sent a post request to inbox.htmx. All right, so the next example that we'll look at is one-click settings changes. One common thing that I've found is that a lot of times I'll have settings that I want the user to be able to change. For instance, one of the examples that I have in my own application is settings for whether they want to receive messages via SMS or email or just in-app messaging. And so the idea behind this example is that when I click on one of these checkboxes, it should send that request to the back end, make the change in the database for that user's settings, and then I should be able to see it in the page without the page refreshing. So the example, the initial example that I show you in a little bit uses AJAX to get the same functionality that we can get with HTMX. The HTMX example includes a little bit of hyperscript for animation, and hyperscript is a additional JavaScript library, an additional library that's written by the same author as HTMX that provides some increased functionality. So it's again, it's not quite React or Vue or anything like that, but it's a neat little tool to look at. And in this example, I'm just using it for animation. You can read more up on it on the resources that I'll provide at the end. The example here returns the HTML directly from the view instead of a fragment, and it loads the response to a different location. So what you'll see as we look at the code here, so this is the initial view, and on the lower right, you'll see the AJAX. And if you're like me, AJAX has always looked a little rough. But what's going on here is when we click on one of the checkboxes, and again, this is the checkbox portion that's repeated for each of those settings. And we have a little bit of difference, setting 1, setting 2, and so on. But this is overall, each of those checkboxes is repeated. So when I click on one of them, we're going to include the CSRF middleware token. We're going to post to the user settings view the JSON contents, which include the settings, so the checkbox itself, and that token. And then we're going to, if everything's good, then we're good to go. So the only significant difference here with the HTMX version is instead of this chunk of AJAX JavaScript code, we just put these additional tags right into the HTML and add an ID here on this div. So in this example, we're posting just like in the AJAX example to a view. And here in this case, it's settings.htmx. The trigger is when I click on it. So when I click on the checkbox itself, the target in this example is going to be the ID or the tag, the HTML tag with the ID setting one response, which you'll see down here. And we're going to include the HTML tag that's named settings. All right. So if I go to the next one, the view here for our settings view, we're loading up the HTML. If we receive a post, we get the current user, and we're going to set the values. So we get the setting value. We either set or unset. So we're just going to toggle the user's setting. And this toggle setting one is just a model method that that does that toggling. And then we return the response. So the significant difference, again, this view is the initial view using the AJAX version. Here is the changes if we're doing HTMX. If we have a successful toggle, we will return the HTMX response, which is just this little fragment here. And I included this in this way, in line with the view, instead of in a separate HTML file, just as an example of what you could do. This same thing, you could include this little fragment of HTML here in its own file, but it's so small that it just seemed convenient to put it right in the HTTP response of the view itself. So what we're doing here is we're saying, and again, this is using hyperscript. So this little underscore equals here is hyperscript, and it's not necessary for this example, but just adds a little nice touch. So what we're saying here is this div. After the page loads, we're going to wait 2 seconds, and then we're going to remove the entire div. And all the div is a little alert that tells the user that, hey, you were successful in clicking the checkbox and toggling that setting for the user. So what does that look like? Here's the initial view. And again, this is the one using AJAX. So it's going to do the kind of the end result that we want, but it's a little complicated, and it gets really complicated when you start adding lots of settings, because each setting requires some additional AJAX to make it work. So when I click it, you'll see we are posting to the settings view, and if I go ahead and reload the page, you'll see that setting actually really is there. If we look at the HTMX version, it's not going to be a whole lot different, except that we've added that little hyperscript CSS animation. So when I click this, you'll see we get a little thumbs up, and then it disappears after a couple seconds. So it's just a pattern, again, that I kind of see often, where you want to have some sort of either a checkbox or a drop down, or some sort of setting that is made from the user. Make that change in the back end without reloading the entire page, and it's a convenient and common kind of thing to have to do. The next example is forms in multiple tabs. So forms, especially if you have a lot of forms on a page, sometimes it can be really challenging having to scroll up and down the page to see everything. Additionally, you might have forms that, um, in this example, we have multiple forms in each, one in each tab, and each has a separate submit button. With standard Django, templates, it gets a little complex when you're doing stuff like this. If I have multiple forms on a page, or multiple forms, one in each tab, because you have to prefix each form and do some special stuff. So in this example, again, each tab can be submitted separately, and we want it to, just like before, make that submission without refreshing the page. This is something that I use a lot. Here's an example from my own web application where I have a few different order forms where a district member or a farmer can enter the amount of water that they want to have delivered to them for irrigation. And they should be able to click on one of those tabs at the top and then submit that form. And only that form should get processed in the back end, only the one that they are actually filling in. So this can be used for, profile settings, tenant configuration kind of stuff, order forms, as in the example here. All right, so to get this functionality, we're starting out with just a basic form. Pretty no nonsense here. And this is what the HTML looks like in the standard example that we're going to look at. So we have a default tab. We have the tab content, and you'd have multiple tabs here, and you'd have multiple, chunks of tab content, one for each tab down below. And for each one, we're loading in a form. In my example, I've got form 1 through form 5, just to give us something to work with. So pretty straightforward. The view for the basic example is not as straightforward. So this is our tabs view. If we've got well, let's look here. So form 1, form 2, and so on for each form that you want. We've got to prefix it so that Django knows which form has been submitted. If you have multiple forms in the same page, that'll cause issues if they're all named the same thing. For each one of these forms, we're looking at the post content. We're again prefixing the form and filling in that data. And then if it's valid, we're just going to save it. And then for our context, we provide each form. So again, looking back at the previous page, that information all gets filled in here, and we get multiple forms and multiple tabs. So what's the issue? Again, you got to prefix everything. It gets a little confusing when you've got lots of forms. You end up with really long views, and all of the content has to be loaded each time. So this is a real challenge, especially if you've got select boxes with lots of options. You have to load all of those forms into a single page when the user may only really care about one of those tabs with the forms within it. Um, so you can end up with really large pages. And I initially transitioned some of my content in my application to use HTMX for this exact reason, because for each of those order forms I showed you earlier, there may be hundreds of different options in that drop down box. Let me scroll back here. So this is the water user, or the tenant, company that's with the district, and this is the different places that they can receive water to. And each of these select boxes may have dozens or hundreds of options, and you can imagine if we're loading multiple forms, that gets really complicated, really heavy page load. So what do we do differently for the HTMX version? Uh, well, this is the old version. So in the HTMX version, we have multiple tabs, and we're going to have a single div for the actual content. And I'll show you that in a second here. Every time we click on one of those tabs, we're going to populate that same div tag with the tab's contents. When we load up the page initially, we're just going to load that div with the first tab's contents, just kind of our default view there. and you'll see that each tab's content loads independently. And this is a kind of lazy load approach where until I click on the tab's contents, it's not loaded up. It's not you know contributing to the initial page load. So here we go. Um, we'll look at this first. So the tab's contents, and I've put this in a separate HTML file. Um, so this is for form 1, and we have a separate one for form 2, and so on. Um, when this tab button is clicked, we're going to, or I'm sorry, when the form button, the submit button is clicked for the individual form, we're going to post to the tabs form 1 view. And again, in this example, you have a different view, but a very small view for each of your forms submissions. Excuse me. The target is going to be the form div, which is the overall div that's encompassing this form. And we're going to swap out the outer HTML, which means everything here is going to be swapped out. And then we've got the form itself. So this is the tabs that this content will fit into. So it doesn't look a whole lot different than before. We've got an initial div, and we're going to get the content for form 1. We're going to load it about 100 milliseconds after the page. Verify here with the most recent version of HTMX. And you have a code repo that I'll talk about at the end here. We're going to target content down here, this tab, the inner HTML. So what we're saying here is, when I click this, we're just going to, whatever comes back, or I'm sorry, when the page loads, whatever comes back from that view, form 1 view, we're going to push it into this div. And then for each of the tabs that we want, we have very similar, but instead of the trigger here, the default trigger is going to be, and because it's that initial trigger is kind of baked in. So again, this is our initial loading. This is for each tab. When we click it, it'll push that content in here, and this is the content that gets pushed to each tab. The views themselves, so this is the initial overall page load. Tabs.htmx is just all of these. And then this form 1 HTMX view, and you'll have one for each form, but you'll see we have our initial form. The form is valid, and if it is, we save. So how does this look? So we have, again, these 5 different forms. And let me refresh the page again. Pretty straightforward. It loads that initial content here. But if we were to look at the HTML code, you'd see that all 5 forms are actually, in the DOM. They're all loaded up on this page right now. When I click it, the entire page refreshes, and I get this success message. But I don't want that. I want to submit a single form. I want the page single form and always only have one actual form loaded up. And when I hit submit, I don't want the page to refresh. So the HTMX version that we just looked at the code for, In the DOM, there's only this one form. These other tabs just look pretty, but until I click on them, the content for them is not actually in the page. So if I click this, you'll see down the right, form 2. Let me do that again. And now we've made a GET request to form 3. And again, when I click this button, it's sending a GET request to a view, to that form 3 view, and then whatever comes back is pushed into this div. If I submit this, you'll see almost instantly I get success back. It made that post request to the same view, and then brought back the success message here and the form as well. So for each of these, when I click on it, it's making that post request and returning whatever comes back right here. If I, you can see you still have to fill out the form. This example doesn't have errors, but you could easily return errors from the view itself, in addition to the kind of front end validation that's happening there. All right, and the last example I want to go through with you, I don't have slides for this one. It's a recent example that I did, but I will walk through the code in VS Code. Give me 1 second here. Let me actually share the entire screen. All right. So in this example, let me show you what it looks like initially before we get started. In this example, I've got some sort of map content, or maybe some data tables, or really anything. And when I click here, a pop-up shows up with some content. Now, that's fine if I only have, I think I have 6, pieces of example data here. Each one, when I click it, something pops up. But what has happened in this example is when I load this page, the entirety of all the data for each of these things I can click on in the map, all of the data for this pop-up and for each of these pop-ups has been initially requested at the same time from the back end. So this might be making use of a REST, something like Django REST framework, where I'm requesting all of that content initially when the page loads. And you can imagine if I have, for instance, a data table and the user requests to view 100 items at once, and I have pop-ups and things like that on that data table, or I have this map, and I want to load up all of the content. And so each of the content, the content for each of these pop-ups is also included. That can quickly bog down your computer. If you have hundreds of items and each one of those has, some text and a link to a picture, etc., that's a lot of data all at once. And I found, in my own application, even with caching and utilizing the best optimization techniques I could, um, I just ended up with pages that were too slow and not responsive enough because there was just so much stuff loaded. So what we want to do here is do some lazy loading. When I click on one of these, the same content should appear, but it shouldn't be loaded initially. It should be loaded up when I click on the box. So we'll go through the code here real quick. Initially you want to set up obviously your media root for your pictures. Um, in this example, and I'll once again I'll mention the code repo at the end here, but we've got Django leaflet and Django GeoJSON. Um, so leaflet is providing the mapping functionality, and GeoJSON is providing the this initial all the content here, which includes the boxes and the pop-up information. I took this example, the models and some of the other basic stuff here directly from the Django leaflet example on their GitHub repo. So in their example, they have this mushroom spot model that includes a title, a description, a picture, the geometry, and also this model method, model property for getting the picture URL, just kind of a little helper method there. Again, pretty much straight from their example. We've got a template view which pulls the map, and I added a second one here for our HTMX example. This here is getting the all of the data for the model mushroom spot. We're pulling the title, description, picture URL, and ID, and then for our HTMX version, I've got this little view here, which I'll show you in a minute, which is just grabbing, if you provide it the mushroom ID, it returns all of the contents for the pop-up for that mushroom. And just to clarify, this example is a little contrived here, just for expediency. In reality, for both versions in this example, I'm still providing the title, description, picture URL, and ID. In a real example, and and in my own web applications, the nice thing is that instead of having to provide all of this, you might just provide the title and the ID in the initial page load for every item on that data table or map, or whatever data intensive thing that you need popovers for. You just provide the title and the ID. So the title, letting you, display what that thing is, and the ID letting you pull um, the individual instance from this view. So the view itself, to pull our mushroom data, really simple here, right? We have a template, and I'll show you that. All it is, it's very similar to the pop-up that already exists, but we have an image, we have the title of the mushroom, and we have a short description of that mushroom. So going back to the view, we try and get the mushroom based on the mushroom ID. We provide that mushroom in the context, and we return the template response. So again, mushroom picture, mushroom title, and mushroom description. The initial non-HTMX version of this view looks like this. We load up our leaflet tags from Django leaflet, including the JavaScript and CSS for it. Here I'm setting the container so it looks nice and big. We have a data URL, which is where all that data for the map items and the popovers is loaded from. And then we have this event listener for Django leaflet, really for leaflet itself. And just to clarify, leaflet is a JavaScript mapping library, and Django leaflet is a Django package that kind of simplifies the process of using leaflet in your own application. So what we've got here is an event listener that says, hey, when the map loads, we're going to add for each feature that comes from this data view. We're going to load that up, and then we're going to add this content, which is the picture, the title, and the description, just like very similar to this fragment that I showed you earlier. But we're going to load it directly into that feature on the map, and we're going to bind that content to a pop-up that's attached to that feature. And then we're going to add all of that to the map itself. So hopefully that's I've tried to avoid as much JavaScript in this talk as possible, but this is sort of necessary, and this is pretty much straightforward from the again from the example that's provided on Django leaflet. And let me remove that because this is not the HTMX version. So down here we are loading the leaflet map, and that's all there is to this entire page. Again, what that gets you is this right here. All right. So what's the difference on the HTMX version? Very little. So we're still loading up the leaflet tags, the JavaScript and CSS. We still have this same data URL. And again, as I mentioned, in a real example, you would use a data view that's only returning the most basic information that you need. So probably just the title and ID for simplicity. Now, what you'll see is new here is I have this layer on click function. And that's because when we bring in content from HTMX in JavaScript, like we're going to do just a moment here, and I'll show you. But when we bring that stuff in, HTMX isn't necessarily aware of what you've done. So we have to tell HTMX, hey, something has changed, via JavaScript. So go ahead and process any new, any HTMX stuff that's in the document body. Go ahead and process that now. So when I scroll down a little bit, really the only changes that you'll see are in this. So instead of including, if I go back, remember we had the image, we had the title, and we had the description loaded directly into that pop-up. In the HTMX version, you'll see that I'm loading a couple divs here. This first div, we're saying HTMX do a get request on maps / the ID. And if we go back, hopefully I'm not clicking around too much, but if we go back to our URLs, you'll see that maps / ID is this here. It gets our mushroom data. So the trigger here is on load. So go ahead and when this content loads, when a pop-up opens up, go ahead and make that get request. And then the target is going to be data div and the ID, which is the second div that we have down here, data div and the ID of the mushroom. And much like the previous examples, we're going to swap the outer HTML. So just replace that whole div with whatever comes back from the view that we've made this GET request to. And that's the only changes here between the two. We're telling HTMX about the change we've made. I should clarify. So we have this on-click layer on-click functionality. So when I click on one of the features, it's going to load up this content, and then it's going to tell HTML or HTMX go ahead and process it. And that's really all there is to it, to getting lazy loading on popovers. And that get request is going to return this little chunk of HTML that we looked at earlier. So it's just a little fragment of an HTML template, Django template, that includes the picture URL, the title, and the description. So this is going to be a little bit maybe of a non-event here because it's going to look exactly the same. When I click on it, exactly the same functionality, but you'll notice I just made a post or a GET request down here in the networking tab. I made a GET request to maps/5, which is the ID of that mushroom. And same here, when I click on this one, we requested ID 6. So it's lazy loading this information instead of requiring you to have all of that data ahead of time. And in a real world example, you might want to in this content for your pop-up, just because of the amount of time sometimes it takes when you click on something to send that request to a server somewhere and get back to you. You may want to have some sort of uh, dummy content in here, just um, a title, and maybe the word loading or something like that. But in reality, it's usually such a quick load that it's much like this. It's pretty seamless and um, not noticeable to the end user that you're actually doing lazy loading. I use this a lot. As I mentioned in my own web application, it's very data heavy. And so I want to be able to pass a lot of information to the end user. But those users are oftentimes farmers working in areas where they don't have really good internet connections. And so doing this lets me, get them the initial information they need to see in a table or a map, but lets them um, pull the information they need by clicking on something and loading that up instead of pushing all that information into the initial page load. So last kind of thing here we'll talk about is some tips, best practices, and resources for working with HTMX. Um, with Django, anytime you're submitting a form, a post request, you're going to want to make sure to pass along the CSRF token. And cross-site request forgery, which is what that stands for, it's basically just an attack that forces an end user to execute an unwanted action on a web application in which they're currently authenticated. Django takes care of this for you by each time you load a page, you can include the CSRF token in that page. And then when you submit a form or make a post request in some other way, like via AJAX, you send along that same token, and Django is able to figure out and match up the initial request with the post that you've made. It just helps to prevent some security issues. Django has built-in support. It provides a token from the back end, and then, like I said, it compares it to what you've submitted in your post request. There's a couple different ways that you can achieve passing that along in HTMX if you're not using forms. Um, One is to include it directly inline, so you just add an HX headers attribute there, and you include the CSRF token. And this is just like in any other template, Django template. You're just including that template variable of CSRF underscore token. The other way that I kind of prefer is if you just throw this chunk of code into your base HTML page. Uh, every every post request you make will via HTMX will automatically include that CSRF token. It just makes it a lot easier. Just very straightforward. You don't have to worry about including it every time you're doing another request with HTMX. One thing that you'll see with HTMX is that you will probably, if you're using it correctly, you'll probably end up with a lot more views, and you probably saw that with the form tabs example that I showed earlier, that instead of one big giant view where we're processing each of those forms, we had an individual view for each form. And that can be a little scary at first, that you've got all these forms or all these views. But what happens is you end up with much smaller views. It's much easier to work with each of them, and you really understand every time I'm clicking on something, exactly where that processing is taking place, instead of having to scroll through, a giant view that's trying to do just too much. Some of the complementary JavaScript libraries, as I said, HTMX is very focused. It's not designed to do everything on the web. So you can use Hyperscript, which is designed by the same creator as HTMX. It's very speculative in the sense that it's kind of out there on the cutting edge. And then there's Alpine JS, which is really lightweight and focused, and a lot of people find it to be a great complement to HTMX. And these can both give you, those additional tools that are maybe outside the scope of HTMX itself. Django HTMX, which is developed by Adam Johnson, um, is a great additional little utility that you can use alongside Django. It provides a debug handler, so when you have debug set to true in your settings, it can help you narrow some things down. And it has a Boolean. So in your view, you can say, hey, if this is a HTMX request, then go ahead and process it and just send back a partial HTML, a fragment. But if it's not, do a full reload of the page and send all of that back. And it's got a bunch of other similarly useful utilities. Some additional resources you can look at. HTMX.org is a really well organized site. It's got documentation, it's got examples. Most of those examples are not using a true backend, but they can kind of point you in the right direction. There's an awesome HTMX repository on GitHub that lists out lots of different examples for different backends. It lists out different talks that have been given, podcasts, etc. Everything to do with HTMX. There's a HTMX Discord, which is very active. The creator of HTMX is on there all the time. If you like memes, you will really like that Discord. They have a good time, and you'll learn a lot. There's an HTMX subreddit that has some good stuff. There's also, I didn't mention here, an HTMX Stack Overflow tag that you can check out. And then last thing is the notes and codes for this presentation. I've listed the GitHub repository there. If you give you about an hour after this talk is done, I will upload the latest version of all the code there as well, to include the example for the lazy loading with the maps. I really appreciate you guys sticking with me through this presentation. It's probably a little longer than I originally intended with the additional example that I added, but hopefully it was useful in kind of seeing what you can do with HTMX and Django. And I think that's about all I've got for the presentation itself. Thank you again.
Thank you. You're the only person I can hear clapping, but in the comments, there's a lot of positive stuff. And in my employer, Octopus Energy, there's discussion going on in the back end. So well done. Yeah, great job. You certainly have sparked a lot of interest. So, well, we have some time for some questions. I have some, so I will, if people ask questions, I'll inject them in, but I'm going to start with the first one, which is from me. One of the things that I liked about this presentation is that you are clearly working towards patterns. And yeah, I'm seeing like well done and awesome and stuff like that. But anyway, so you clearly are working to patterns and like, for example, template fragments. And there's a certain way that you're executing on that. And I was wondering, and when I tried to use HTMX over a year ago, I properly ignored, well, I didn't even know these existed. My question is where did those patterns come from? Are those your own, or did you take inspiration from someone else?
So that's a great question. Really, I would say for the most part, they're kind of my own, just things that I've observed over time. And HTMX is still really new. Um, I think a lot of people are still kind of fleshing out their understanding of the best practices. Um, Unfortunately, I can't remember the name right now. There's a gentleman. He's on Twitter. He's always in the HTMX Discord, and I'll add a note on my repo when I update it here in a little bit with his name and a link to his information. But he's got a really good example, or he's got a good page that kind of talks about breaks down his understanding of HTMX best practices for use with Django, and some of that like just the terminology of fragments and putting things in a folder called fragments within your templates. I've gotten from him. As far as patterns for kind of overall uses, there are, like I mentioned, some good examples on the htmx.org page, including some basic like lazy loading. Uh, you know, um, just there's a bunch of examples there. You should definitely check it out if you get a chance. Um,
Is
but
there a
some of
way?
the
Go ahead.
some of the the examples that I provided, like doing things in tabs. I think there is an example there, but I kind of worked out the benefit of that before I even had seen that example, um, and being able to implement that in Django and uh, just save on that page refresh or page load time. It definitely helpful.
Awesome. Yeah, one of the things that excites me about this is that it's not. Django was where you're using your examples from, or where your examples are coming from. But this will work fine with anything that serves out HTML. So Flask, Rails,
Absolutely. Yeah.
PHP. It's not limited to that. One of the
And there's a
questions.
bunch of there's a bunch of on that awesome HTMX page. There's a bunch of examples with, for instance, Rails and other backends as well.
Yeah. So one question is, when a fragment is loaded, or when a fragment is loaded or triggered, can you specify a JavaScript function instead of doing the swap? Can you be like, can you call function? And the advantage of that is clear, because then with JavaScript running in a template, that opens up doors to like hitting other APIs and stuff. And so I was wondering how that works. Because I know you did the on click, or you loaded that as part of the AJAX method of fetch.
You know what? I'm going to be honest. I have not tried that myself. Um, I think what you would have to do is that same kind of. Let me see. I think you'll get that same functionality as long as you have something in that resulting. Um, as long as you're processing it in this way, doing the HTMX process to tell HTMX that you've changed something.
Awesome. Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, in your leaflet example, you use JavaScript to let um, HTMX work, but I wonder. I mean, that's something. If someone wants to look that up right now. Oh, and Greg Bell says I have, and yes, you can. In fact, you can trigger multiple things. It's passed as a header. So there's. It sounds like there's all kinds of tricks that you can do with it. So that's kind of
Oh, there are.
interesting, especially for me, because these days I do a lot of stuff with Jamstack rather than doing Django templates. And that someone asked a question earlier, and I have my own opinion, but I'll let you answer it first. Is HTMX better than React or Vue or these other you know
The
uh,
only correct
vendors?
answer is yes. It's opinions, right? So I really enjoy HTMX for a few reasons. First, it's really small, and second, I hopefully nobody out there is hating me. I'm not a huge I don't enjoy writing JavaScript. I and I know there are a lot of people that do. But when I'm focused on Django and developing, I want to be able to focus. Um, So being able to add a whole lot of additional functionality with something I'm already comfortable with, it's just HTML with some, additional attributes. It just makes things so much quicker than having to,
Oh,
kind of
absolutely.
switch contexts and do things in another language.
I agree. Well, I see one of the things is the difference between using taking HTMX and Alpine and the whole kind of restacking of a lot of the front end onto the back end, where that has its virtue is if you are trying to move quickly and you are not having to worry about multiple clients. If you are having to deal with multiple clients, like for example at Octopus, we have the web client, we have the mobile client, and then we have business to business things that we have to account for. There we have to be API driven. But if you don't have to be API driven, then yeah, HTMX is going to be faster than building one application, which is your back end, and another application, which is going to be your front end. If you have a
Absolutely.
primarily server side approach.
And I should also clarify, like, HTMX it's a great augmentation. So you're not going to be building, standalone map application, web applications with HTMX alone. But like the example I provided, if you have something that already exists, like Leaflet, you can augment it, in some ways with HTMX to get some really good benefits.
Yeah, I want to see about doing the fancy S3 upload or upload of large files to S3 buckets where you skip the backend, you skip the Django or the Rails or the Flask or
Mm.
FastAPI. One of the reasons why I ended up going with Vue.js several years ago is making that work in a Django environment was without using a framework like Vue or React was hard,
Mm.
or it's harder than necessary. So, yeah, I want to now check HTMX and see if that's the case because there is a legacy application that I maintain on the side where not having to transition to Jamstack for it would be much easier than because that's a rewrite. So Sam
Oh, yeah.
Cyril Bryant, who's a colleague of mine at Octopus, says we have a lot of backend devs that need to be able to modify some of our front end. That can be a blocker when we need to go away and learn React in order to do anything, and that's true. And uh, it's not that we aren't capable of learning React, but it's what are your priorities? If most of your work is backend, and then to implement a relatively small
Oh,
feature,
yeah.
you have to jump into learning React or Vue or modern, the whole enterprise. I don't know if that's the right term. The whole front end JavaScript revolution. That's a huge amount of work compared to something like HTMX, which is just essentially some tags and fundamental JavaScript.
Absolutely.
And someone else says the main advantage is not jockeying JSON around to produce HTML. That is true. Yeah, whenever I get around to working on two scoops of Django again, I'll like ask you questions about that because right now it's not in the state where we want. Okay, so let's ask you some more questions instead of telling you what I feel. Let's see. So, all right. So I have some questions that I'd like to ask people in general, and I'm just going to ask just so I know that there's people of different skills and levels that are listening. Um, well, actually, so the first one is, what was your first programming language? We know you know Python, and you've got an idea of how JavaScript works.
So I've been very fortunate to kind of been working in programming off and on, and only in the past few years really kind of got back to doing it sort of professionally, I guess. Making money from it. When I was a lot younger, the whole reason I'm not a band geek today instead of doing programming is that my grandmother was a software engineer. And when I was a kid, it was pretty much my parents had the choice, limited money and whatnot, between getting me something that I wanted, a clarinet for band, or getting a computer, which seemed really nerdy. Well, we got the computer, and it was an old DOS 386 back then. So I don't think DOS, batch programming is really a programming language, but that was really like my first experience with with computing and programming was those batch scripts, and I had like 3 giant DOS manuals, and I just
I
couldn't get
had those.
enough. It was a lot of fun.
What do you miss about working with DOS compared to, say, Python?
Uh, well, looking back at that, it's probably more. There was probably nothing more fun about it per se, but it's just you reminisce about that first experience, just being able to see, when I enter some information and run it, that initial like, wow, look what I just did something active, um, and I think I haven't lost that love of you know putting
No,
some code
I
in
get
somewhere,
that.
hitting a button,
I
and
get that every time. Greg Bell says Apple Basic represent. I started on Apple Basic, so go Greg. I get that when I'm working with APIs and stuff, and I get that first connection, and it might be trivial, right? It might be like hello or ASDF. JY is 4chan. That's crazy. Um, and I just get this rush and thrill, and it does bring me back to those early days. So I definitely, um, yeah. So I it's fun to have that. Okay. So my next question is, so I've mentioned Octopus Energy, and for those of you who don't know, we are a renewable energy company, and our mission is to save the world. If you're looking for a job, we're hiring. This is to
it's very
everyone.
ambitious.
Yes, it's very ambitious. And so what I like to ask people is, what are you doing to help address global climate change?
So, I think this is not a direct thing, but indirectly, the web application that I've built, Watervize, I kind of mentioned it before. It's for utilities districts, and while our focus, I wouldn't say, is on saving the world, as much as Octopus Energy, which is awesome. I think we do indirectly, contribute towards that quite a bit. A lot of irrigation districts and smaller water districts in the Western United States, they're doing everything on paper. They're manually calculating things. They're doing all their scheduling, on paper or in Excel, or and it's a very slow, long, tedious process. Not very efficient. So the application that I built and have been running for the past 3 years or so, 4 years now, it just helps them to streamline a lot of those manual processes, um, which again, it's not a huge contribution to reducing global warming, but um, when you're not having to use as much paper, when you're not having to put as much labor into just figuring things, how your a utilities district is operating, it definitely saves resources and helps them in that regard, and especially at a time now where water is becoming a I don't want to say a hot commodity, but it's a limited resource, and I think the world is realizing that more and more. Um, we just help to uh, help districts manage that limited resource better.
That's excellent. Water management is a huge issue in the state of California, and
Oh
there's
yeah,
some legacy things in place that they're slowly trying to get out. And for those of you who are listening in, farmers essentially have unlimited, in the Central Valley, of unlimited access to the water table. And well, farmers need water. Having unlimited access essentially for free also means that they're draining it faster than necessary, and now they're trying to institute rules, and there are ways to grow in the Central Valley without just wasting as much water, like tree skirts and other things for watering,
yeah.
which
It's
was
shocking. It's shocking how many of districts in the past weren't even tracking how much water was being used, by each farmer, for instance. Um, yeah, it's
so
it's pretty wild just how much water is
wow.
used on crops.
Well, so I've mentioned that my company is hiring, and you can see in the description for this, there's a link to our careers page. But I guess, is Watervize, are you guys hiring, or
Watervize. So it's
Watervize?
kind of like
Okay.
supervise and water. Yeah. So we're not yet. It's still pretty small, but I hope to be offering some employment within the next year or so.
Okay, awesome. All right, let me see if I have any. Oh, another question I have is, so there may be either newcomers to programming who are watching now or watch this in the future. What one awesome bit of advice can you give to them to help them in their career?
Ooh. So I think honestly, there's a lot of divisive comments on Twitter and elsewhere about people who are looking up information. And I think a lot of that stems back to when we were all kids, you had the teacher that told you you'll never have a calculator in your pocket, or you'll never, you need to learn this stuff rote. Well, the reality is, I don't think there's any programmer that understands everything completely. Looking it up is important, and I think that the best skill that you can have is being able to search for things. So, kind of having a thesaurus in your head of, the kinds of terms that you need to use to find the information you want. Um, I Google stuff all the time, and a lot of times I'm answering questions on like Stack Overflow or on Reddit or something that, uh, not necessarily I didn't necessarily know the answer right off the bat, but I know how to find that answer. Knowing how to get the information is just so important, and I think that
Absolutely.
applies to programming and just about any technical thing in life.
Absolutely, I agree. We have the internet, we might as well use it. And the thing is, if you search it, there are times when the more you search, you start to remember things too. As you
Oh, absolutely.
digest information, the pieces start coming even without you having to Google it. And one of the things I tell at Octopus, what we tell people when they come on board is, feel free to ask as many questions as you need. That there are no stupid questions. And we embrace that. But certainly Google foo is very much a skill for any software engineer.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And if I can interject real quick, I did see one question in the comments that from Javier that I hadn't answered yet. He had asked about returning multiple fragments, to update multiple things in a page. And so what you actually would do in that case, Javier, is your view would return it just returns one response like always, but that response would have multiple divs, and in the page that you're loading that information to, you would have, if you look on the HTMX.org site, you'll see in the documentation, you'll do what's called an out of band process. And basically, what HTMX will do is it'll say, okay, the div that's has an ID of this that's coming back from that view, I'm going to put here, and the div that has this ID, I'm going to put over here. And that's how you would update multiple things in a page at a time. In fact, if you go to the htmx.org, if you look at the examples, I think they have a couple different examples of doing just that, doing out of band, um, processing to get multiple updates from a single, uh, viewpoint. Hopefully that
Okay.
makes sense.
Yeah, it definitely does. Yeah, that's one of the things I liked about HTMX. It's not changing things, it's adding things. I mean, it requires a slightly different way of looking at things, but not dramatically so. And I think that's
Absolutely.
part of why so many, especially back-end focused engineers, really enjoy working with HTMX. Um, okay. So we have a few minutes left. I slotted 90 minutes for this. Are there any questions from the audience? Anything else? Okay, not seeing anything thus far. We'll give them a few minutes.
All
Uh,
right.
and Watervize, you're based in Washington D.C., right?
So it's a little confusing. So our the business address is actually in Yuma, where I was when I started the business.
Yuma,
Um,
as in Yuma Beach,
Yuma,
California.
I should clarify, Yuma, Arizona.
Okay.
So I'm actually active duty Marine officer. Um,
Oh,
yeah,
okay.
that's my day job, I guess. I work on Watervize and do programming. outside of that, so on the weekends or after work hours, kind of whenever I get some time, um, and trying to keep a good work-life balance at the same time. But um, so when I was in Arizona, my husband actually worked with a lawyer who dealt with all the different utilities districts, um, and they were like I mentioned before, they were doing everything on paper or in Excel, and they knew that I kind of did some programming, knew some technical stuff, and kind of reached out to me for an update. What they originally asked for is just an updated Excel workbook that they could work with, and I quickly realized when you're you know dealing with dozens of farmers who want water on revolving days, it might be more than 24 hours. That just doesn't fit really well with an Excel document.
No.
um, and yeah, so Watervize just kind of grew out of that. I previously had no real experience with agriculture or water, but I've got probably the world's foremost library on irrigation and irrigation management at this point. Just reading through tons of stuff to make sure that I'm building something that makes sense. Doing a lot of
Awesome.
communication with people, in that industry, and um, I don't know where I've completely lost track of the question you originally asked, but
That's
that's
it. No, I was
that's kind of
asking
how
about
this all.
location, but no, thank you for giving us a little bit of background about Watervize. So Sam Searles Bryant, who again he's a colleague of mine from Octopus, he asked, "What is HTMX not so good for?" And I'll just so now our watchers can see this is his question.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, again, I think it's important to understand the scope of HTMX. That its focus is very narrow. It's intended to. I'm trying to remember Carson Gross, the author of HTMX, how he describes it. That it's, um, it's like an enhancement of HTML. It's not designed to be a full framework for building big components and stuff. So you're not going to build the next Gmail necessarily with HTMX, but you can augment and provide a lot of the functionality that makes Gmail or something like that better with HTMX. So it's a fantastic tool for really just augmenting, right? It makes basic traditional Django templating better, and it can take if you're using something like React or Vue, um, it can just add some simple augmentations where you may not necessarily need to write an entire component. You can just add a little HTMX in to do a lot of things. Hopefully, that was just
I'd
word
love to
soup,
see
but
how feasible that is because I didn't think about like, will it actually work inside of like an XJS app or a Vue app? Well, that's worth trying out. If someone in the audience wants to try it out and let me know, I'm really curious because that could be interesting. Okay, so we have 2 minutes left. I'm just going to close this out. Jack, it was an absolute pleasure having you. Thank you for presenting and showing us some of your newer code and also sticking around to answer questions. As I mentioned at the start of this, in hopefully I'll have at least one more slated for this year. If not, in 2022, I'm going to do more discussions like this. Some of them with presentations, others, we'll figure it out as we go along. So if you want to if you want to see those, I guess if I'm doing the YouTube thing, I have to say like and subscribe. Um, but yeah, thank you so much. And again, if you're looking for a job, we at Octopus we do have jobs in software development, and however, we're limited that we can only hire in countries that we have offices. But if that doesn't include your country, understand we're expanding super fast. When I started, we were I think in 3 or 4 countries, and now we're in 10, and that's only going to increase. So again, Jack, thank you so much.
thank you. And as I mentioned, within the next hour or so, I'll update my repo with the latest code additions, and I'll ask you. I'll text you the that link if you would add that to the YouTube, that'd be fantastic. Thank you again for this opportunity, and thank you for everyone that joined.
Yeah, thanks everyone. We really appreciate it, and the commentary was beautiful. Thank you. Take care, everyone.